So there have been a lot of protests lately in Europe, particularly in Spain, against mass tourism. And I want to talk a bit about tourism and its pros and cons because, well, to start off with, what's interesting about these anti-tourism movements is they often use the phrase tourists go home, refugees welcome. I saw that spray painted a lot in various places in Europe or posters saying that. And what I find interesting about that is how basically they're complaining about tourism because they claim it undermines their culture, it makes their cities and towns overcrowded, but yet they have no conception of immigration, which includes so called refugees, a term which is very tenuous because a lot of these so called refugees are basically economic migrants, like these Syrian refugees from Ghana or wherever. But yeah, I mean, when you look at that, it's very hypocritical. It's a huge double standard how they see tourism as creating these problems, but they don't see these problems as being created by immigration. And I mean, I think that's the most obvious take from all this, but I want to delve a bit deeper because, yes, it's obvious that the anti tourism movement is very hypocritical in that regard. But if you take away the aspect of hypocrisy regarding immigration, it does leave the question, do these people have a point about tourism in and of itself, even if they're hypocritical when comparing tourism to immigration? Because I think that immigration creates pretty much all the same problems as tourism plus additional problems, like the additional problem of like altering the local gene pool to the point where like certain ethnic groups risk going extinct or becoming endangered in their own country. Because tourists don't impregnate the locals as much as immigrants do, with the exception of white men in Thailand. And to be honest, I'd be totally fine if the Thai authorities started cracking down on that shit. But yeah, there's that. And when I say impregnating the locals, obviously, I mean both ways, men and women, local men, local women, immigrant men, immigrant women, whatever, like both ways. But there's that, but there's also the fact that immigration has led more to like rises in crime, for instance, whereas I don't think tourists generally go to places to commit crimes. It's more the opposite, that locals will commit crimes against tourists. I mean, yeah, I'm sure there are some tourists who commit crimes, like often just like buffoonery and drunkenness and stuff like that, vandalism sometimes. But by and large, I'd say there's probably more crimes done against tourists than by tourists. I could be wrong, but that's the impression I get, especially when tourists go to places that are known high crime areas. Like they often do target tourists specifically. I had that happen to me in Granada, Spain. Luckily, I managed to avoid them. It was two teenagers who were trying to mug me. But yeah, I'm pretty sure they kind of ethnically profiled me by looking at me because one of them signaled the other. Like he kind of tapped his finger as soon as I walked by. And I'm like, okay, he's signaling him. And he probably saw me and thinks, hey, this really, Northern European looking guy is a good target. So, and those two guys, by the way, they look like they were brown. They weren't ethnically Spanish. I'm pretty sure they were either Gypsy or North African, possibly Latin American, Middle Eastern. I don't know. But yeah, some sort of indeterminate brown. But yeah, okay, putting aside the hypocrisy of this whole issue, it does raise the question, is tourism inherently bad? Honestly, yes and no. Because I think the anti-tourism movement, they have a point about certain specific types of tourism that are very bad. Like Airbnbs have a tendency to displace local residents. And I think they do it in a way that hotels don't do. It has something to do with like zoning laws and the type of establishment that can be an Airbnb versus can be a hotel. To my understanding, Airbnbs overlap more with apartments in terms of the types of places that are allowed to be one. It's kind of a loophole in the same way that like SUVs and pickup trucks have a loophole where they're considered a truck rather than a passenger car or whatever. So they have different emission standards. It's one of those bullshit loopholes. So yeah, Airbnbs displace local residents a lot for that reason, because I guess they're classified as apartments and not as hotels, even though they function more as hotels. And to my understanding, that's the issue. I'm not sure 100%, but I think that's what the issue is. So yeah, I can completely understand the opposition to Airbnbs in particular. I can also understand the opposition to cruise ships in particular, because they tend to let out tons of people at once who just completely crowd the area, and they don't tend to spend a lot of money. Plus, I don't know, do cruise ships specifically do damage to like buildings that are near the waterfront because of how big the fucking boats are? I don't know. It wouldn't shock me if they did. So yeah, there's a number of reasons to be against cruise ships that I agree with. Also, just large tour groups in general. They're annoying, not only to local residents, but to other tourists. So again, I can understand wanting to ban those specific types of tourism like Airbnbs, cruise ships, large tour groups. In regards to tourism in general, though, honestly, I think it's a bit of a double-edged sword, because there is the economic argument, and it's true. Like, some of these countries very strongly depend on tourism, and if they got rid of tourists, their economy would be fucked. Or at least if they tried to discourage tourism heavily, their economy would still be fucked. However, even aside from the economic argument, because there are some people who also argue, yes, but being economically overly reliant on tourism is a bad thing. And if you discourage tourism, you would encourage these countries to economically diversify more. Now, the question is, will they or won't they actually succeed in that regard? They may or may not. So there's that argument. And I don't want to focus too much on the economic argument, because people do make economic arguments for immigration also. And some of those arguments do have at least some validity. So I would rather focus on the cultural argument, because I think that's really the linchpin of the issue. Like, does tourism help preserve local cultures, or does it help destroy them? And I think, honestly, I think it goes both ways. Because on one hand, tourism does hurt local cultures insofar as, like, a lot of local businesses close and open these like shitty like souvenir shops that appeal to tourists. Also, when the tourists seem to outnumber the locals, it's like, who even is a local anymore? Like, there's hardly any locals left. And I get that. But on the other hand, a lot of tourists, when they go to a place, they do want the authentic experience. And that means a lot of tourists want certain aspects of the local culture to be preserved. Like, they definitely want the architecture to be preserved. Like, there's a reason why tourists flock to cities like Venice and Florence, as opposed to, say, Oslo, Norway, because Venice and Florence have better preserved architecture. Or even within Italy, for instance, like, you don't see them flocking to Messina. And Messina, for those who don't know, is a city in Sicily that was destroyed by an earthquake in the early 20th century. So it's one of the very few cities in Italy that doesn't have a ton of historic architecture. And yeah, you don't see them flocking there, or to the planned city of Latina near Rome, which was built, I think, under the Mussolini regime. And again, more modern, doesn't have historic architecture. Like, again, in Italy, it's hard to find a place that doesn't have historic architecture. But again, that's part of the reason why so many tourists go there. Like, there's definitely a correlation. Like, sure, there's some odd places here and there that don't have much historic architecture or natural beauty and still get plenty of tourists. But by and large, tourists do flock to places with historic architecture. And there's a reason why certain places are so overcrowded, like Dubrovnik or Venice or Barcelona. It's because they have so much historic architecture and such beautiful historic architecture. And I think it is an incentive to preserve it. Because if you look at some of the wealthier countries in Northern Europe, the ones that don't depend on tourism as much, some of them have been a bit more liberal with destroying their historic architecture, like Stockholm, Sweden, with the Norrmalm redevelopment in the 1970s. Or in the UK, for instance, in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, they did destroy some of their historic architecture in cities like Leicester. Am I pronouncing that? Leicester, Leicester. Yeah, that Leicester, I think, is the right pronunciation. Like, they destroyed some of their Tudor architecture and other historic architecture in some historic cities and towns to build shopping malls. And again, one thing I've said many times is certain countries are rich enough to be ugly. And it wasn't just World War II that caused this destruction. A lot of it was post World War II. And in a lot of cases, the modernists used World War II as an excuse to destroy even more historic architecture. Like, well, some of it was destroyed already, so we might as well destroy the rest. It's a very stupid mentality. Like you're already somebody cut off your left arm, so you might as well cut off your right also. It's just a very dumb mentality. But yeah, I mean, I think it's partly because frankly those countries are wealthier and they don't rely on tourism as much and they can afford to be ugly. Well, at least financially they can. The question is psychologically can they? And I think it does hurt them. I think it makes people there more depressed. It makes them less happy than in countries that have more historic architecture. Although at least they still have some left, like in Northern Europe. Like it really varies a lot from country to country. But my point is, yeah, I do think there's a reason why countries like Spain, Portugal, and Italy have the most per capita historic architecture, I would imagine. And it's because they're a bit poorer, they're not quite as wealthy as the Northwestern European countries, and therefore they financially rely more on tourism. Now, again, obviously, this isn't true across the entire world. Like, there are plenty of poor countries that don't have much preserved historic architecture, and there are some rich countries that do, like some in Northern Europe, like, say, Switzerland, Austria, Denmark have a fair amount. But nonetheless, I do think, at least within Europe, there is a correlation, and I do think that wealthier countries have more of a tendency, whether because they're not relying on tourism and also because they can afford more to like have these massive redevelopment projects with all this ugly modernist shit. But yeah, I do think there is a connection though. Like I do think tourism provides a financial incentive for the preservation of historic architecture. Another thing is, I think a lot of tourists, like there's been criticisms about local restaurants closing because of mass tourism. But to be fair, I don't think tourists are the ones who are constantly clamoring for more like McDonald's and Burger King and stuff like that. Like when I go into those restaurants in Europe, and I don't go there anymore to eat, I only go there to use the bathroom. Like I haven't eaten at McDonald's in over like 3 years now. Or the other mega chains, like the biggest of the chains. I've eaten at some like fairly big chains, but not like the like top 10 global biggest ones. Like I've been avoiding those. And yeah, but every time I go in one of those McDonald's or Burger King or whatever in Europe, it's overwhelmingly local teenagers. And when I say local, I mean including the immigrants, but I mean people who live there, not tourists. Some tourists do go there, it's true. But by and large, I think most tourists, when they go to these places, they want to eat at the local authentic restaurants. Now, you could argue, oh, there's different types of local restaurants. There's some that are more touristy and others that are less touristy. Fair enough. But I'd argue even the touristy local restaurants are still more authentic than like having just McDonald's everywhere or just kebab restaurants everywhere. Unless you're talking about Turkey where kebabs are from. But I mean, like, you know, much of Europe, you know, those are the two types of restaurants that seem to be the invasive species, like the global mega chains and then the non-local, like ethnic restaurants, like kebab, shawarma, it's Chinese food, etc. Whereas the local cuisine seems to be what gets displaced the most. And I'm sure some people would argue, well, there's a third category of invasive restaurant, which would be like, I don't know, certain things that are a bit more hipstery or touristy as opposed to like authentic. But then it's like, well, hipster, I wouldn't even say hipstery because hipsters like authentic stuff. More like, I don't know, gentrifier chic type stuff as opposed to like, you know, really kind of working class local type restaurants. I mean, there's definitely gray areas there and you can dispute all day about which types of restaurants are more authentic than others. But I think the ones that definitely are a problem are the fast food mega chains, like the American/Canadian globalist mega chains. And then also like the shawarma, kebab, etc., which are just not the local food. Yeah, I mean, I would agree, but my point is, I think tourists by and large want to eat the local cuisine, and I'm not sure if they would be a net negative for local restaurants. They might be, but I I'd have to see more on that because from my own experience, I do get the vibe a lot of tourists do go to these local restaurants and they do want to. At least in some countries. Maybe not as much in like countries that aren't renowned for their cuisine, like Netherlands or whatever. But definitely in like Italy, for instance, or France, or like Greece, or a country that's like renowned for its cuisine, tourists do tend to flock to these places. And yeah, I will admit it is a delicate balance. Like over tourism in some places is definitely a thing, and I think it's a consequence of global overpopulation. Like there's simply just too many people in the world right now. But and that's another thing. It's like we can't just build another Venice. I mean, we could. Like China tries doing stuff like that, but it just always tends to look fake and it lacks the historic context. Like I think like it's one thing to rebuild something in the same place where it used to be. I think those can be authentic, like they can feel authentic if they're done properly, but literally building like a second Venice or a second Florence on the other side of the globe, it's always going to feel kind of fake, even if it was done well architecturally, simply because it wouldn't be the real place and it would lack the geographical and historic context. I don't know. I don't think it's a worthy substitute. Let me put it that way. I mean, so it's like, it's true. You can't just build another Venice. And even if we did build new places with beautiful architecture, the truth is they still wouldn't have the historic resonance of a place like Venice or Florence, even if they were just as beautiful, which again is very difficult because in this day and age, it seems like we've actually regressed in terms of our talents for building good architecture. Like it's really hard for people today to build really good reconstructions, reproductions, or even just entirely new buildings in the styles of historic buildings. Like often they end up really screwing it up. Like I'd say the cases where they do it really well are the minority, sadly. And again, there could be monetary issues behind that also. But my point is, you can't just build another Venice. So it's like over tourism is going to be a problem as long as overpopulation is a problem, frankly. Because you can't just create a new alternative to these places, and these places are always going to be crowded. I guess the only thing they could do is like promote certain underrated destinations more in the hope that people go to those places instead of always going to Venice or Florence or whatever. But will that decrease the tourism in like Venice and Florence, etc., or will it simply increase the tourism in these formerly underrated off the beaten path places in addition to the places that already get a ton of tourists? Because again, there could be some people who travel so much that it simply means they found one new place to travel to in addition to the places they already go. But again, are those like people you see on Instagram who just travel constantly? Are those really the majority? Or are the majority the more casual tourists? And like, if you give them an alternative destination, maybe they will go there instead. I don't know. It's hard to say. It's really hard to say. Like, there's sort of like the theory of induced demand, like with building new roads. Like, does induced demand apply to tourism also? Where it's like, oh, if you promote a new place as the tourist destination, it just means more tourists as opposed to like relieving tourism from the place that's already congested. I don't know. I don't have the answer to that, but it would be an interesting thing for people to study. Because I mean, like even in Europe, there are still some historic cities that I'd say and smaller towns that are definitely underrated. Like I would say, at least when I was there, Porto, Bologna, Strasbourg, Graz, Ghent. I mean, there's probably a few more. Bratislava, maybe. Bamberg. Turin. Genoa. I mean, places that like get considerable tourism, but not a ton. And those are just bigger cities. Like smaller towns, there'd be a ton more. Like Visby, Sweden, on the island of Gotland, extremely underrated place. It's like it's so underrated that like you actually have signs in Swedish alone, which is very rare in like a bigger city like Stockholm to not have English. But yeah, I mean, I guess that could be one solution to over tourism, but I just don't know to what extent it would actually work. at relieving the tourism from the like more congested destinations? Like, I'm going to be honest, like, I don't have a firm answer to the question of whether tourism as a whole is a net positive or net negative when it comes to the question of cultural preservation. Like, I would say for immigration, I would firmly say it's a net negative in terms of cultural preservation. But tourism, there's a lot of pros and cons to consider, and it's honestly not an easy question. I will say though, like I love traveling and I still want to keep traveling. I don't know, like are there ways to travel more ethically in terms of like what you do, in terms of what destinations you visit, in terms of how much time you spend there or what you do while you're there? I mean, probably, but it can be difficult. I'll say one thing, if you travel somewhere, at least try to like help with the local economy somewhat, like eat at a local restaurant, buy something from a local grocery store, stay at a hotel that isn't a mega chain, like do something that will put money into the local community because you're not necessarily putting money there just by being there, especially if you just take a day trip and you're not even staying overnight. Or if you do stay overnight, but you stay at some mega chain hotel, like I guess even the mega chains would pay some local taxes, but I still think you'd be helping the local community more because local businesses always put more money into the local community in terms of like suppliers, vendors, and how they just do their business and who they employ. Um, but yeah, I mean, those are some ways that you can help. But at the same time, yeah, I mean, by being a tourist, you are contributing to over tourism to some extent. And I'm not telling people to stop because, I mean, I'm not stopping yet. I mean, someone would have to stop me, frankly, but or circumstances would have to stop me, like if I became seriously disabled or something like that. But yeah, I mean, otherwise, I would want to keep traveling as long as I could. And of course, there's the whole environmental aspect of it, like the carbon emissions. I haven't really touched on that in this video. I mean, I've talked about that in a lot of other videos, but yeah, I mean, that's also a consequence. Although, again, part of that is just the reluctance to explore greener technologies and invest money into them. Like, can we have greener airplane technology? Probably, but oh, we're pouring money instead into like AI and like I don't even know what we're pouring money into because a lot of tech seems to be plateauing these days. I guess AI is the big thing. And yeah, one other aspect of the anti-tourism movement that I do want to touch on in this video, it's a bit of a touchy subject, but I feel like I have to address it, is like the northern versus southern European kind of ethnic animosity, because I do detect an undertone of that. Like I even see southern Europeans using the word gringo, which originated in Latin America. Like that's not even their word. That's a word that was introduced to them by immigrants from Latin America. And it's kind of bullshit that they're using that word, but they do. Like people in Spain and Portugal now use the word gringo against northern Europeans in this context. But yeah, I mean, okay, in regards to that whole aspect, it's like, listen, you guys joined the European Union. You're happy to take those transfer payments from Germany and from the wealthier Northern European countries. You're happy about that. You're happy about being able to immigrate to those countries if you want a higher paying job. But oh, you're not happy when they come to your country as tourists? I don't know. That seems kind of hypocritical. I mean, if you're going to say, you know, Spain is not your theme park, then frankly, the Germans could just as easily say Germany is not your office building. And frankly, it would be just as legitimate for them to say that. And frankly, I'd rather my country look like Disneyland than look like some fucking dystopian concrete and glass fucking monstrosity, which is increasingly what these wealthy Northern European cities look like. And again, the term Disneyland, it's basically like these modernists always use this against all historic architecture. They will always call it Disneyland, even if there's no tourists. That's really where the sentiment comes from. But yeah, honestly, I do think there's a bit of hypocrisy there and in these kinds of sentiments directed toward Northern Europeans and also by extension toward people from the Anglo diaspora, Canada, US, Australia, New Zealand, who are basically seen as Northern European descendants, mostly are, and are called gringos also. Who even is a gringo though? Like, are the French gringos? Are Slavic people gringos? Like Russians and Poles, are they gringos? What if you're Italian American? Are Italian Americans gringos? Are Quebecois gringos? Like, where do you draw the line? I mean, or what about like German Brazilians, like people of German descent in southern Brazil? Are they gringos? I guess not. I don't know. But um are Austrians gringos? Austrians in South Tyrol, are they gringos? I don't know. Like who's a gringo and who isn't, you know? But yeah, I mean, my point is, yeah, there's that aspect of it also. And frankly, it's like I don't like when Nords hate on Meds, but I don't like when Meds hate on Nords either. Can't we all get along, Euro bros, white bros, you know? Like, I mean, come on. But yeah. And I mean, obviously, it's not just a Northern Southern Europe issue because people do complain about over tourism in places like Amsterdam, also. Like, it's been a huge thing in Amsterdam. But still, it's often perceived that way, especially, I think, in Spain, Portugal, Italy, and Greece. Like, it is perceived as like a trend of like, Northern European tourists coming en masse to Southern Europe. Like there's definitely some of the reverse also, like Southern European tourists going to Northern Europe, but it's just not as many. Like not nearly as many. Like I saw some Southern European tourists in Northern Europe, but again, it's not quite as common as the reverse. But yeah, I mean, I think that's most of the aspects of this issue I've covered here. I will say to tourists, you know, maybe if a place is overcrowded, you know, with tourists, maybe only go there once, you know, like, do you have to go to the hot spots over and over again? Maybe just go, you know, just go there once and then go to less crowded places afterward, you know? Like, I don't know. Like, maybe try to broaden your horizons a little bit more. Because, yeah, some tourists, they really do only hit, like, the hot spots, but they totally neglect the places that are considered, like, B-rate, C-rate tourist destinations. But, like, sometimes the B-rate, C-rate ones can be just as great, you know? Like, I mean, like, in Italy, for instance, like, Lucca, that's a beautiful small town. Again, I don't know how many tourists it gets now, but when I was there, it wasn't that bad in terms of the number of tourists. Or like Turin, for instance, Bologna. I mean, again, like, I know yesterday's off the beaten path destination is often today's on the beaten path destination. It's like, oh, a place is off the beaten path, give it a year, right? Then it'll be on the beaten path. Like, I know how that is, believe me. Like, I went to Tallinn in 2019, Tallinn, Estonia, and it was full of tourists, and I was shocked. I'm like, really? This many tourists in Tallinn? But yeah, I mean, fair enough. Like, it's harder and harder to get off the beaten path as time goes on. But still, I'd say at least try a little bit, maybe, to not just go to like the hot spots. Maybe go to some of the other places as well. And yeah, especially if you've already been to the hot spots. Like, do you need to go there over and over again? Or maybe you could expand your horizons a bit more. Because again, sometimes the on the beaten path places are on the beaten path for a reason. But do you have to keep going back over and over? Like, you know, maybe give another place a chance rather than like going to Venice or Florence like every other year. You know, maybe only go there once or twice. Like, fair enough. But yeah, I guess that's my opinion on that. So, I mean, it's a complicated issue. I'm sorry I don't have any more definitive answers. But... And I mean, another thing, okay, one more thing I will say. When people say tourists go home, it's like, okay, if your home was Nebraska, you'd understand why people travel. I'll say that. It's like, okay, like I know some places are deprived of money. Some places are deprived of jobs. Well, some places are also deprived of beauty. And that's another factor to take into consideration. Like, I get it that this argument can be used to justify mass immigration also. So it's like, you know, I'm treading on thin ice by bringing it up. But it is true, though, that like some places are deprived of beauty, both architectural and natural. And it's like, there's a reason. I mean, even people from beautiful places will travel, but it's like, okay, there's a reason why certain people maybe don't want to stay home all the time. You know, if their home is fucking hideous, like, I get why they want to travel. Let me put it that way. And it's probably part of the reason why Germans travel so much because, like, a lot of their cities today look hideous ever since World War II. So, although there's plenty of beautiful small towns in Germany, but again, like small towns don't necessarily provide the same experience that cities do. So I totally get why they want to travel to cities in other European countries, as they very frequently do. And again, same with people in the Anglo New World countries. There's a reason why they want to travel because a lot of the places they live are fucking hideous. And again, it's partly their own fault because they vote for policies that make their local communities hideous, and they're definitely hypocritical about it, but it's still a legitimate reason to want to travel, I think. So, I mean, yeah, I'd probably want to travel even if I lived in Prague, but I'm just saying. So yeah, I guess that's my opinions on the over tourism issue and whether it's good or bad for local cultures.